Computer.
Recorder to that computer, and then then the issue, it's going to store it in some download on your computer, and then if you can put it in some drive and send me the link, then I'll post it.
Sounds good.
Okay. Fantastic.
All right.
Greg, I'm not positive about this, but that other option of save to cloud, that may work as long as kind of anyone's here once you start that. I don't know. So if you're the host, you drop off, that cloud recording may keep going even if you drop in and out.
Okay.
And you
I made Steve the host, so if he's got it rolling, then that would be
perfect.
But yeah, that's probably the wise way to do it.
Well, there's both, and there's like a longer conversation, but there's quality differences depending on which one you pick and which way it prioritizes like the speaker. And so often, because we're doing it on podcasts and things, and I want my recording to be the best, I do it locally. But then Sarah on my team will be a co-host, and she'll do it to the cloud so that we actually get both of them. So then if there's an issue with any of it, we just have more tries. So you can do that as well if you want to both record or whatever. So
do you post audio or video as well?
It's a post up. Basically, it's a recording of the screen. So it includes, the whole, basically what we see. So, Nick.
Hey, how you doing?
How you doing, friend?
I'm doing. Oh man,
working hard, huh?
It's impossible to not. And I got a patient with COVID right now, so I got I gotta see him every day. I gotta put on the whole like plastic gown and all this stuff. It's a lot of work.
Jesus, that's brutal.
Yeah, it's good work though. It's meaningful stuff.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I really, when I worked in the various psychiatric hospitals that I've been at, it's intense, chaotic, but meaningful. And certainly when you have gifted psychologists around, I think that helps. So I'm glad you're there, friend.
Thanks. How are you guys doing?
I'm good.
I'm good. I'm great. So I'll go ahead and start. Other people will come in, but I'll just go ahead and start with my intro. So I'm definitely looking forward to today. All right. And in terms of the distance of the journey with the whole tree of knowledge, Steve Quackenbush goes farther back than anybody of my academic colleagues. And so this is really meaningful at that level. He's an executive member. I think that Steve and I both encountered psychology in a similar way. In fact, on my STOA, I was talking with Zach Stein, developmental educational philosophical psychologist, and recognized the problem of the naturalistic fallacy and the relationship of is ought and the feedback loops between what we say we are, what we can be, what does that mean in relation, and deep conundrums about that. And I think that this sits at it's one of the very profound elements of the problem of psychology. It's certainly a profound connection between the problem of psychology and philosophy. And at least when it comes to the problem of value, I don't think anybody's grappled with it and sort of the depth that Steve has grappled with it. And so it's a real honor and a privilege then to sit with Steve. He's a wonderful educator, a wonderful guy, and a really deep thinker on these issues. He and I encountered each other in the context of debates that were happening on the SSCP, that's the Society for Science and Clinical Psych listserv. I think you were. Is that where you were, Steve?
I think it was Division 24.
Maybe it's Division 24. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And so Division Theoretical Philosophical Psychology. And I was on several lists at the time, and I was trying to, I was a young gun. This is like 1999, 2000. I was a young gun starting to say, hey, this tree of knowledge solves all these damn problems. And at first he was like, he loathed it. He was like, what the hell is this thing? How could you possibly say that? You don't even address the value, you idiot. Okay. But then when Steve got hooked into justification, then all of a sudden it was like, oh, wait a minute, this thing's a little more complicated. And ever since, the relationship between justification, the tree of knowledge, what psychology is, has been for me, a very enriching and fun conversation that he and I have been engaged in. When I was fortunate enough to produce a couple of special issues in the Journal of Clinical Psych, Steve, I wanted Steve to contribute, and he wrote what I would say is really the best article in that joint issue. I mean, I believe this. Remythologizing culture. It's an unbelievably excellent articulation of the dynamic between social construction, how we wrestle with these kinds of issues. He offered another excellent article 3 or 4 years later when we did a special section in the Journal of Theory and Psychology. So I think the vast majority of psychologists profoundly underestimate or don't grapple with or just pretend it doesn't exist. The problem of value that haunts our field. I don't think anybody has looked more carefully and reflectively at this issue. And we're damn lucky to have Steve come here and share his intellectual history with this. And Steve, you're a lifelong friend here on this journey, and I deeply appreciate you and what you bring to this.
Well, thank you very much, Gregg. And a couple of quick things. I'm going to tell the story of a philosophical crisis that I am not fully free from. So it's an ongoing problem for me. And an interesting question to think about is what light can the ToK system shed on this crisis, and what role can it play in helping us to resolve this problem? And so with that, I'm going to take a few seconds, and I'm new at this, so let me just make sure I can do this right. I'm going to share my screen. So let's see. Tell me when you see something.
There it is.
All right, great.
Yep.
So I just came up with the label, The Problem of Value in Personality Theory, and really, because I'll just key in on personality theory, but really, I want to tell my story and how this problem emerged in my consciousness from the time I was an undergraduate through around the time I met Gregg. So I think that'll be a nice kind of end point. So it's basically, well, if I go back to the late 1980s when I was an undergraduate, I took a philosophy class and I encountered the so-called is-ought problem, related issues, the naturalistic fallacy. I learned about it. I took tests that included questions about it. You can't derive prescriptive claims from descriptive claims. You can't derive an ought from an is. I have a link here. I can share this PowerPoint slide later. You can click on the link and read about the naturalistic fallacy. But I didn't really care. I mean, it was an interesting issue like anything else. No correlation. Correlation does not imply causation. That was interesting too. The is-ought problem was nothing special to me. It was simply one more academic problem among countless others. All right, so then I head off to graduate school, Kansas. I'm from California, but I head off to Kansas State University. And in my first semester at Kansas State University, I'm taking a social psychology class taught by Leon Rappaport. This would be the fall of 1989. And I encountered this really interesting article from Taylor and Brown, 1988. And I'm just showing you the abstract. This is what I saw back then. Illusion and Well-Being, Social Psychological Perspectives on Mental Health. They make this striking claim that modest to moderate positive illusions, which can include unrealistic feelings about or unrealistic self-views that are positive, unrealistic optimism, are associated with various measures of well-being. And so I'm intrigued by this because you normally would assume that healthiness is reality testing, and they key in on that in their very first paragraph after the abstract. Traditionally, reality testing has been the hallmark of mental health. Okay, so I'm intrigued by this. wow, modest cognitive distortions in a positive direction may actually improve well-being. But as I continued to think about the topic, I started to, I don't know, part of me I just didn't like it. I had always had this kind of just assumption that it's good to like seek wisdom and understand yourself and your world better, and even a little bit of pessimism. I just like, as Emerson says, man swings as a pendulum between truth and repose. Choose which you will, you can never have both. That we have to decide, we should be seeking wisdom, or do we want to seek repose? So I was kind of bothered by this. And this wasn't me being questioned. I wasn't questioning the findings. I recognize most people probably rely on various cognitive distortions to make it through their otherwise dreary day. But I didn't know that this was a good thing, regardless of what the relevant research had to say. So I started to think about it more fully. Okay, let's take the observation that the mild positive illusions, unrealistic positive views of themselves, are associated with subjective well-being. And as I started to think about this, it dawned on me, you can interpret this the way that Taylor and Brown were interpreting this. This can be read as suggesting a need to foster mild illusions, suggesting a need to foster mild illusions to preserve mental health. Great, but the same findings, the exact same findings could also be read as an acknowledgement that we may need to sacrifice subjective well-being if we hope to gain wisdom. That is, you may have to give one to get the other. So the problem of value started to become more salient to me. Wait a minute, which one do I value more? Subjective well-being or wisdom? Now, there were other findings that needed to be dealt with. It may be true that positive illusions are linked with other positive outcomes like altruism, but that link itself, I started to think, might be ethically problematic. I don't want people to be altruistic. I don't think it's good that people are altruistic. If that altruism is dependent or contingent on some sort of positive illusion. I would like the altruism to be rooted in something other than positive illusions, even if that's not typically the case. So for at least this time, I think, I can remember thinking at the time, wow, this is the problem of value. This is the is-ought problem, the naturalistic fallacy. There is no research study that I can imagine that can answer the kinds of questions that I'm posing or that I'm thinking about by encountering Taylor and Brown. I can't make a judgment as to whether I should value wisdom or happiness based on any research findings. So it is not possible to articulate a vision of the good life by considering human nature as it so happens to manifest itself. Great. Does all that make sense? If I pause there for a second, that we've got these research findings. Our values are going to help shape how we determine them or how we interpret them. The research findings themselves cannot determine the value that is going to guide that interpretation. Great. It's pretty simple. And at that time, I thought it was quite profound and an important discovery on my part in my philosophical development. But in retrospect, it's a pretty simple idea. And I think at that time, I had managed to put the problem of value in quarantine. And that word, for some reason, is salient in my consciousness these days. So here's what I was doing with the problem. I thought, okay, great. We got this problem. The is-ought problem is seemingly limited to cases where basic and applied psychologists are making value claims. As long as they don't bother making value claims, they don't have the problem. So focus on nature, the facts of the matter. If you do that, the problem of value would presumably, this is what I thought at the time, never emerge. All right, so then a few years later in graduate school, I encounter the work of Robert McCrae and Paul Costa. And they had a book published in 1990, I think, called Personality in Adulthood. And that text included a remarkable thesis that doesn't really need to be our main concern right now. Personality, conceived in terms of the 5-factor model, is generally stable in adulthood. Okay, once again, like with the Shelley-Taylor the Taylor and Brown thesis. I'm intrigued. This is different than what I've been encountering in my developmental psychology courses. And by the way, my focus in graduate school was developmental psych. So that's my background. And McCrae and Costa are well aware of the revolutionary implications of their thesis. The idea that personality should be so deeply and permanently ingrained is revolutionary in a scientific climate in which growth, change, and development are the watchwords. So here we have this idea that your core personality stays stable through adulthood. William James said that the personality is set like plaster by the time you're 30. McCrae and Costa essentially agreed with that. If you're a jerk at the age of 25, you'll probably be a jerk at the age of 70. If you're really shy at 30, you'll probably be pretty shy at 75. Okay, I'm intrigued by this. It goes against the way I normally think of the personality. But it also kind of bothered me. But it bothered me, and I didn't feel like I had good reason to be bothered, because take a look at the data. You can't ignore the large quantity of data in support of the thesis, the long-term stability of scores on the NEOPI, for example. Okay, so I have this new finding. I began to wonder, though, in what ways might this thesis reflect value commitments? Well, the research is what it is. So I started to think about the research. And I started to think about the problem of reliability in scientific psychology, and in particular personality research. McCrae and Costa assert the fundamental principle of science is reproducibility. A phenomenon must be dependable regardless of how and by whom it is observed. That's another idea I encountered, like a good many of us, as an undergraduate, and I didn't think deeply about it any more than I thought deeply about the is-ought problem. Reliability, it's important. Your phenomenon needs to be reliable across raters, across situations, over short periods of time. But then I started to think, because for some reason at that time, I was reading books about the quest for the historical Jesus. And so at the time I was puzzling over this, because when I was looking at some of the writings on the, quote, quest for the historical Jesus, it seemed to be this sort of thing. Let's take all of the reports that we have regarding the historical Jesus, and let's look for the lowest common denominators. Let's look for what these reports have in common, and then we can be reasonably confident that's true about the historical Jesus. We have to treat with a little bit more skepticism reports when it's only coming from one source. And then I started to think, wait a minute. When you do this, what you end up with is a very lifeless religious figure. You get this lowest common denominator, but what's missing is Jesus as Jesus would appear from the perspective of the writer of Matthew, John, etc. And so I thought to myself, what's more real, the lowest common denominator or the relationship between gospel writer and the figure Jesus? So I started to doubt the demand for reliability across raters, or I started to see as a value that might have certain implications. Across situations, why on earth am I obliged to be reliable across situations? We'll put that one aside. This one seems pretty straightforward. Test-retest reliability. Tests, measures of personality, the NEOPI, needs to be reliable over short periods of time. That's pretty straightforward psychometrics. So let's key in on that one. This insight occurred to me, and I'd be interested in seeing if I'm wrong here, then my philosophical crisis is over. If I can be shown that I'm wrong here. A trait that can change over an extended period, say 2 years, must be able to change over a short period, 2 weeks. I simply can't imagine a trait that is locked in place every 2 weeks, but has the freedom to change over a longer period. How could the change ever even begin? So I started to think that implicit in the idea of perfect reliability over short periods of time is eternal stability. Now, we can play with this a little bit further. To demand perfect consistency over a short period is to demand stability over an extended period. The perfectly reliable personality is thus an effectively petrified personality. I almost subtitled this presentation, The Coagulation of Character, or something close to that. If it seems obvious that traits can change over an extended period, which in fact they can, the stability coefficients aren't perfect. It is because personality measures are never perfectly reliable. So it's an artifact of the fact that you can never perfectly, you cannot ever measure with perfect reliability personality. You can't get perfect reliability over short periods. You can't get perfect reliability across situations and across raters. If you hypothetically could, you'd have this eternal essence revealed, this form that is a personality that cannot possibly change. So this brings me to a few observations I had around the time I met Gregg, and I was in the throes of this philosophical crisis, and Gregg is now promising the system that could potentially help us understand many of these kinds of issues I was grappling with more fully. So here's what I came up with back in 2001. An epistemology that identifies truth with reliability necessarily grants consistent personality dispositions a privileged place in the holistic study of lives. The unqualified demand for reliability and the authorization of transcontextual traits so that these traits effectively tell our story. I know what you think you are, but deep down inside, we all know you are, fill in the blank with whatever traits the person is supposedly burdened with, are thus two sides of the same coin. If we choose to think about the self in terms of pure, perfectly reliable, transcontextual traits, then holistic personality change is inconceivable, even if it happens. The best we can hope for are new, deeper insights into a genotypic personality structure that has always existed. And I said, even if it happens, because we know it does sometimes happen, but if you think this way, you have to doubt it. Is it substantive personality change? Or is it merely the surface runoff or something due to the situation that you're speaking of and not a core enduring trait? If reliability is not valued as such, we still have reliable phenomenon. Reliability doesn't disappear as an empirical phenomenon, but it is simply one more interpretation of who we are, among others, an interpretation from, to use Dan McAdams' memorable phrase, the vantage point of he calls it the psychology of a stranger. The Big Five model is a kind of psychology of the stranger, a lowest common denominator articulation of who we are. If reliability is recognized as an epistemological value, then it is only a matter of time before researchers are forced to conclude that the personality, holistically conceived, is generally stable. As long as this value is not challenged, perfect consistency will continue to haunt everything we do in psychology, even again, if in fact the findings aren't always consistent with that. So here, different from what I discovered with Taylor and Brown, where the ought could be quarantined, or the is-ought problems could be quarantined to the ought domain. Here, I found woven like a worm into the heart of basic psychology is the is-ought problem. And it's at the level of epistemology. So as I was thinking about this talk for today, and I want to put at the very end here, and this is the last slide, my abstract, I decided to try to piece it all together in relation to the ToK. And so the first line here, the applied psychologists are aware of the problem of value. We think we know what this means. Yet insofar as scientific epistemology is riddled to the core with human values, the fact-value distinction is also relevant to the work of basic psychologists, even when they don't think they are ever articulating a value claim. For example, the demand for reliable truths effectively seeds the tree of scientific knowledge in the soil of value. Now, this is my qualifier in the potential path forward. as appropriate as this demand may be in the study of matter, life, and mind, as appropriate as it may be, and maybe it is, in those domains, it comes at a price when imposed within the domain of culture. And then I say here, with reference to the quest for the historical Jesus, you might be wondering what that's doing there, but now you know. I will argue that the unqualified demand for reliability in human psychology inevitably gives way to the coagulation of character. As such, the very rules that scientists impose on themselves should not be imposed uncritically on human beings. That's my problem. Let me see if I can end the slide sharing. Stop share. Thoughts?
All right. You hear me okay?
Yep. Okay.
Sweet. Well, thank you, first off. I appreciate that very much, especially to an insider baseball fact value guy. I find this to be a very fascinating set. So lots that I could possibly say, but I'm not going to say anything until that I need to, other than thank you, Steve. So let's open it up and see who's got questions and see where that takes us. And at any time, I can circle back around and start to tangle with this set of questions. Mike's got some, and then Lee.
Yeah. So Steve, my intuition about you is confirmed since I read your Sartre paper and since I see you in what I assume to be as a black shirt. You're a philosopher and you have such a deep understanding of the philosophical underpinnings of psychology that what you have to say, in my opinion, points out loud and clear the source of the banality of our discipline. I think you're right on about this question of the fact-value distinction, the is-ought distinction. I think it's psychology's commitment to an objectivist worldview, the standard story of science, that somehow we can eliminate the effect of the observer on the observed, and especially value judgments that blind psychologists to the fact that I'm going to say virtually any measurement that we make, any construct that we have is thoroughly structured is thoroughly embedded and prefigured by our value judgments. And our failure to do that brings us great havoc because we believe our data. We believe that if we ask somebody what happiness is, we've measured well-being. We believe that if we have, this notion of reality testing, that we are in touch with some reality that somehow can be tested objectively. And in my opinion, it is any construct that we study, that we pretend is an objective fact, destroys us. For example, let's study social competence. Can't be done in any objective sense. That is a thoroughly evaluative concept. Let's study the development of formal operations. Well, just the second you said that formal operations is developed something, you're placing it on a higher scale or a higher value than something else. And our inability to see how our factual claims are prefigured by value presuppositions that we're often not even aware of leads us down a rabbit hole. I congratulate you on your black shirt.
It's blue. It's like
I'm colorblind.
lighting in this room.
Wonderful. Yeah, I told you, Mike. I thought you and Steve would appreciate some.
No, I really do.
Reflections along these lines. This is the entanglement here of the knower is quite profound. So Lee, you had a question.
Yeah. Thanks for this. Turns out I've actually studied the 5-factor model, probably not in the depth of you guys, but deeper than most engineers. So I'm an introvert. And my understanding is that many of the personality traits have genetic bases. And it's been a while since I've looked at this, but I think introversion has to do with an allele on the serotonin receptor having to do with how much excitement it takes to get you excited. So if that's the case, if that allele on the dopamine receptor is an important component of introversion, that's going to be stable over time. But I describe myself as a high functioning introvert. Okay. I was a department head of Bell Laboratories. I gave talks at international conferences. I even gave a talk on this forum, although I read from notes. So there are behavioral things that I've learned to be able to function better in the world. So if you take the 5-factor test, what is it, NeoPi or whatever, first off, there's always going to be measurement error in all of that. That's you know, what mood are you in today, and are the questions defined and everything else. So that is several levels above the stable fact of the allele of my dopamine receptors here, okay? So there's going to be measurement error in the tool, and there's going to be learning and behavioral changes that I make over time. So the fact that using that tool gives different results at different times, to me, is not inconsistent with the fact that my dopamine allele is stable over time.
All right, first of all, the stability of the dopamine allele is certainly not in question by me or
Right.
any thoughtful person looking at the relevant science.
Right.
Extroversion is something else entirely. And it could very well be that the stability in measures, the consistency in measures of, say, extroversion over time can be attributed to the allele or any other constellation of biogenic causes that we might appeal to. So in other words, I don't doubt the stability of the allele, nor do I doubt empirical research that might suggest stability at the level of the phenotypic trait. It might very well be, I'll just, the typical American adult tends to have, I wouldn't doubt this for a second, relatively stable scores on measures of each of the big five, in particular extroversion. Okay, all that empirical claim taken into account. The question then I have is, let's say you're an extrovert or an introvert and you want to change. What do you do? I want to, now there's different ways you could change.
Right.
With my personality students, when I teach the theory, I take the theory seriously and I kind of approach it from the perspective of that theory, of the theory. So if you're, say, a disagreeable adult, there are good ways of being disagreeable. You can become a civil rights attorney. I mean, and there you're going to rub the right people the wrong way. So there's wonderful ways of taking the core traits that you presumably are and using them in healthy ways. That's when I'm thinking like a trait psychologist. If, on the other hand, I want to change and I want to be more introverted, I want to be more extroverted, I want to be more agreeable, I want to be more conscientious, I have to let go of the demand for reliability. I can't think about myself in a reliable way. I have to let go of that scientific value in order to free myself of the vision I already have of myself based on the traits I've lived heretofore. So on an empirical plane, it's everything you're saying is true. But what if I want to change? I have to place in question the values that guide the scientific research that ground the empirical claims. I can't worry about the fact that everyone else sees me a certain way. Inner rate of reliability would say, Quackenbush, you're still the jerk you've always been. You're still the introvert.
Jerk is a value judgment. Jerk is a value judgment. Disagreeable is a value judgment. Okay, there's no science to come up with disagreeableness. Here, I want to say this. Part of the problem that we have with the fact-value distinction and how it muddies our waters is that we accept everyday concepts unreflectively and as realities. Here's one: trait. Okay, Trait is a terribly problematic concept. I would argue there are no such things as human personality traits, which is not to say that human behavior is not stable. The concept of trait comes from the biological world. We see a rock that weighs this amount, a color that looks this way. The tree has this sort of bark. The bark on the tree doesn't change from interaction to interaction. Yet we take this notion, this everyday formist, Platonic formist notion of trait, and we apply it uncritically to human behavior. When we do that, we factor away in the same way, Steve, that you're talking about when we do with retest stability. We factor away the variability in human behavior and we privilege the stability.
Let me suggest something. The phenotype is essentially unreliable. That is, the manifest phenomenon of human personality is, or better, never necessarily reliable. When we demand reliability, we turn our attention from phenotypic experience to the genotype. Hence, we're drawn to arguments about stability in terms of whatever the mechanism might be at the physiological level, as if that's more real than our lived experience. So, who am I really? Well, if only I could map my genome, I could learn. No, who I am really is not going to be found at that level. If we demand reliability, if that becomes our epistemological value that guides our work in personality research, implicitly, the genotype trumps the phenotype. And we have to ask this question, who am I really? I don't ask that question when I relax the demand for reliability in the same way.
I have no idea what you mean when you say that the genotype trumps the phenotype.
It shouldn't. I'm not saying it does. It shouldn't. Quite the contrary. In fact, this is, I in my abstract, I had mentioned that there's a price that you pay when you value reliability at the level of culture. And one of the prices that you pay is this very subtle subordination of who we are to this concept of the genotype. This almost a ghost in the machine, lurking behind the scenes, calling the shots. It's a kind of, let's go back to Sartre, it's a kind of petrification, a Medusa gaze that we, so the trumping of the genotype, I think, is implicit in much of what goes on in personality research.
I get it.
So what do they find with all that trait research?
Oh, gracious me. They find disposition. They find dispositions. They find dynamic dispositions.
That's right.
Which is not the same as a trait. The idea of a trait, how do McCrae and Costa define traits? I invite you to go look at the simplicity of that.
Well, yeah, but you can go to like Allport and he defines it basically
Allport's
as a different frame of reference.
Right. But note that that in Allport's definition of traits, there's some internal filtering. Very interesting notion there. That's very interesting. Note then that there's a difference between the trait and human action, human activity.
Totally. Yes.
So, and then where are these traits? The traits are going to have to be some sort of physiological, biological patterning that disposes you to certain types of actions in certain types of behavior. But
exactly,
Steve is absolutely correct. In psychology, we're living in the lived experience of the phenotype. Our behavior is never trait-like in that way. What Leyland is saying, he's an introvert. Well, you ain't an introvert when you were speaking. There's not first your introversion, which is your true self, and then this wonderful an active person. No, there's different actions that are predisposed by our biology that emerge in different contexts. We have both variation and stability, and we need to embrace that.
I'm 25 different people before I have my coffee. And then usually after I have my coffee, I realize I'm none of them at all. So, you know.
Right.
Just throw that out there. Yeah.
But so this is right. So to me, I love this. So, you know, this is what gets me all excited, these mysteries of psychology and relation, right? And I think so Mike and I certainly, and Steve, I think you would sync up on this. So one of the things you want to know about the history of trait theory is where it comes from. Okay, and it comes from empiricism majorly. Okay, it comes from empiricism at multiple levels. And what I mean by that, Steve's exactly right, that it comes from particular kinds of ways of mapping the world through a scientific lens that has to do with reliability and extracting variance. And it actually comes from the lexical hypothesis, which is a completely raw empirical exploration, which is the idea that you can, well, it's theoretical. In the sense that what they did was they hunted for variation initially, the lexicon meaning word, they hunted for variation in words to see whether they would cluster together as individual descriptors in a dictionary. That's where they actually start to find what these clusters of traits are. And the fascinating thing is they actually do find these clusters. And there's actually a remarkable amount of reliability. So this is the flip side, is that there is something that is being found here. And then the question is, what the hell is that? And then how to frame it. And I think what Mike said is exactly right. You don't know what the fucking trait is. Okay, there's real confusions. But once you start to think about these things as dispositional set points, okay, that have a genotype and then an environmental epigenetic channeling, all right, and then you tie them to theory, all of a sudden they'll start to pop, like neuroticism. So I'm a clinician, I deal with neuroticism all the time. And I see people, by the time you're 16, 17, 18, there absolutely is a dispositional set point potentially for high neuroticism. What does it mean? It means your negative affect system is charged, it's sensitive. It has low thresholds for reactivity. If you get stressed, you're able to get stressed activated. The way in which you coped is all part of that, but it will set point into the time that, but if we know that you're high neurotic at 18, unless you go through Rob's fundamental shift, you're going to be high neurotic when you're 30, okay, with high degree of predictability in relationship, because that fundamental negative affect system idles. It's a dispositional idler. And if we can tie theory to of what it actually is, then we can actually extract the patterns and also not be slave to them in a particular way. It's deeply unhelpful. So that's at least where I'm coming from in relationship to these constructs.
If I may, two things. Gregg, feel free to shut me up, because this has really got me fired up, this whole discussion. One, trait theory terms, they come from language. They come from common sense cultural language, okay?
Right.
So when we say somebody is aggressive, what we're doing is we're making this judgment. We're taking their behavior and we're doing a personal factor analysis in our heads. And then we come up with this word aggression. And then it becomes a thing collapsed over context, and then we put it inside of a person. It is the most primitive way of thinking possible. Go ahead.
Real quick, Gregg, remember our conversation on the listserv a number of years ago about Stephen Pepper's world hypotheses?
Absolutely, of course.
And so I discovered Stephen Pepper's work after my little narrative that ended in 2001 ended. But the world hypotheses, we have these fundamental root metaphors that we use to make sense of ourselves and our world. Formism is one of them, and trait psychology is clearly an example of a formist world hypothesis. But there are others as well: organicism, contextualism, mechanism. And so to recast in Pepper's language what I was trying to say in my 2001 language, it's this. The kinds of transformations that we perhaps ought to experience may require a shift in our fundamental root metaphors. The root metaphors that we use to guide our interpretation of ourselves and our world are themselves as much a reflection of the ought as they are the is. In fact, they make judgments about what the is. They render the genotype primordial in the formist worldview, for example. So the ought, the worm, has finally eaten to the core of the apple, the is. Now, I'm willing to qualify that, or rather hedge, by suggesting that this is a cultural problem, and the biologist can continue to proceed with science as usual without worrying about the problem in the same way. But I'll put that issue aside.
Well, I would say that, so for me, this is where I like Tony Giddens' single versus double hermeneutic problem. So the biologists do have a fact value dynamic because you get into practical utility kinds of dynamics and truth. There are values, there are epistemic values and pragmatic values that do drive a lot of the conceptualization. And so when are you going to cut specificity sensitivity is a value to delineate the truth claims that you're going to make, for example. The P value you set it at. Okay, so it is rife with judgment and value, but the epistemic value, truth value issues are one element. And the other thing at the level of culture, okay, the other thing at the level of culture is the double hermeneutic. So if we tell Lee, you're an introvert, right? If we've done the science and now we know you're an introvert and now we give you that concept, all right, now all of a sudden you are walking around with a justification system, okay, of that. And what I would tell my students was, it's not that big a deal to run rats in a maze and publish a study that says, look at these white rats, they've learned to run this maze a lot faster than these brown rats, right? Okay, now obviously you just, jump up a level and say that you did IQ tests and you found certain kinds of things, and immediately everyone rightfully gets anxious, okay? And the whole problem is because you now have a double hermeneutic in relationship to what, now even if you're in the lab, you now spewed out what is the reality and you create, Freud changed us. I mean, Freud changed the way we think about ourselves by virtue of the tripartite model. I mean, there's my id. I mean, it's a complete iterative conceptual feedback loop. And that entanglement is absolutely profound, which is why we definitely need a social human science division off of the first three dimensions of matter, life, and animal mind. Definitely. Lee, did you have a question?
I have a story that might fit in here. About 200 years ago, when they started experimenting with steam engines, scientists became interested in thermodynamics and they wanted to understand what heat is. And it was noticed that heat flows from hot things to cold things. So they were looking for what it is that flows. And they gave it a name. They called it caloric. They said there's a thing called caloric. It is what causes heat and it flows from hot to cold. And everybody looked around for caloric. Well, now we know that heat is an emergent phenomenon. It's basically the kinetic theory of matter. It's a measure of how the average speed at which molecules are moving around. So the fundamental mechanism is the speed at which molecules move around. We experience that as heat, which is a very reliable thing. You can have thermometers and it's hot when you touch it and everything else, but there is nothing like caloric that moves. And what I conjecture, and I put this in the comments and Gregg commented back on it, what I believe is that many of the constructs that are taken as reliable observations in many social sciences, especially psychology, or for example, the idea of trait is like caloric. You can observe it, you can measure it, but it ain't there. The fundamental thing in caloric is just the speed of the molecules. And I think just that psychology is newer than some of these others, and that just hasn't been resolved. That's the way I think about this.
Harder than that. It's hard. It's a little. I wanted to say something about the is-ought problem really quickly, and that, I would bet that if I were to hypnotically hang around Lee long enough, I could turn him into an extrovert, right? Because if he believed he was an extrovert, to whatever degree his alleles would allow, let's say, he would begin speaking up more, deciding to go out more, like whatever. Like we can be changed in the way that we're justifying to ourselves, right? The way that we have taken on to be a certain truth. And so this is-ought issue, right, is all about what we're valuing in the moment. And to, I think Steve's point, or one of them, and I'm not sure if you were exactly arguing for the permanence of personality, or what I heard later, the important part there is that to change meaningfully, if it's important to you, you have to break up with your own kind of belief about yourself in a way. And that's a very potentially scary, wishy-washy place. And I think Michael's point of one of the basic issues is that we're constantly in ought and we don't notice it at all, right? That's like blind to us, that we're treating ought as is almost constantly. And our own personal is that we're seeing is just layered in every direction with ought, right? All these value oughts that we're not aware of. And many of these are arising out of impulses and emotions and things that are happening very unconsciously to us. Many are in the stories that we've told and taken on about ourselves, in who we're supposed to be, who we ought to be in front of this person or with that person, or to get this result. And at the very core of that is starting to play with those value knobs and showing somebody that if you value this, it leads to this unhappiness that you're going toward. And if instead you were to value this, you would get a different result. And you watch people shift very, very quickly. So I was really not kidding when I was, saying about 25 people before coffee. Like we are incredibly more malleable than we think, but left on default, we're doing this game that we're blind to that makes these things seem so incredibly persistent. That would be what I would, a little bit of what I would say about this, that these persistent things don't have to be as persistent as they seem to be set on autopilot, right? If we just leave them with no external help, it's very hard to see. It's kind of blind to us. So they end up habituating. We end up believing certain things about ourselves. They become very persistent. And Lee will continue living into, or at least claiming, his introversion in some way, but under other circumstances, if it became important to him, if he valued a different thing, he would behave very differently and he would report on himself very differently. And then where really is that trait that, isn't really a thing, but just maybe a useful judgment in one way, but the more we trust them, the more we're lost in that illusionary space, in my mind.
One of the things that comes to mind when you say that, Rob, the malleability of quote unquote traits, is that the typical personality research doesn't study that. It's based on the logic of individual differences, regression, factor analysis, and all of that. What we say when we say that personality is stable, or personality traits are stable over the lifespan, what we really mean by that is that they are stable relative to other people. That the differences between them that are, and that makes total sense. If somebody is predispositionally shy, they're going to be much more predisposed. They're going to remain that so in relative to other people. If you want to find out if traits, whatever that is, are malleable, you got to look at people over time in context. The data are rarely collected. And as a result, most personality research is non-ergodic, if you're familiar with that term.
Well, let me add another dimension to that. And I may be completely misunderstanding how it's meant, but to me, we're completely different, not just against other people, but in different circumstances. If I'm tired, if I'm hungry, if somebody has just murdered my mother, you're going to watch me be incredibly different people and behave very differently in different circumstances. So around a persistent amount of other people that are also persisting how they are, I'm probably going to keep showing up a certain way. But if I go change people, or I change my location, or I change my status, or I change, if I start making more money, all of these things may have a certain habit gravity to go back toward what was comfortable to me, but they will all change. And especially if you start to corner a rat, it's going to behave very differently. Fight or flight stuff comes online. So
2 points. I'll get back to Mike's, but let me just say that. So those that are familiar with the field know the person situation debate. Okay, that happened in Walter Mischel in 1968. Is a behaviorist and social psychologist who writes on these issues. Points out essentially what you just said. And the behaviorist and social psychologists, for very interesting value-based methods reasons, hate trait theory. Okay, so they hate the personality trait theory. And they argue exactly what Rob said, and they were about ready to blow it up And it was on its last legs in the 1970s. And then it gets rescued by a set of very interesting studies that shows there is something going on here in relationship to these clusters of variation that just capture individual difference. And not only do they then carry, at least this is the argument of the trait people, and in the 1980s, enough people get very convinced, and the cross-cultural data come in at a way that's pretty damn impressive, that says, man, there are big three or big five, and this big five captures and gains some significant consensus. Because the reliability with which these big five capture something is impressive as shit. And so there is something there to be said. To me, Mike's point's exactly right. And actually, Steve's wrestling with a philosophical point. What are these things called traits? Okay. And that's why I get insane with the problem of psychology, which is actually we don't have the right metaphysical lexicon to talk about our concepts. And that's foundational to my concern. So the last thing I'll say is just answer to Mike real fast is the double hermeneutic is when the studies that you're engaged in involve concept using beings whose concepts you educate them about, and then it changes their behavior. Okay. So that's the double hermeneutic, as opposed to you can talk about atoms all you want, but presumably they won't care. Okay. Steve, you were saying?
Oh, Greg, I wanted to add something, Greg, to what you just said. Intuitively, what makes sense to me is like the way we frame whatever they found, what you just mentioned in the studies that were done in the 80s. One way to say that would be that there are some programs that run in us, and those programs could be these five, big five trait programs that all of us have access to. And because we find, when we find ourselves in different situations, that some of those programs run more frequently than others. Like that's one way of framing it. Then, like I was actually watching a documentary on octopus. So if you observe octopus in its natural way, the way they behave, the way, like the way you could think about that, like, boy, is that strategy? Is that deception? It's like, it's amazing what that animal, how intelligent that animal is. But when we start using our everyday lexicon to it, that it seems different than it actually is. And so that's how I think about this.
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought up octopuses, then I'll shut up for a second, because actually something very interesting about traits, extroversion, neuroticism, and then for the social animals like dogs and primates, people can assess animal behavior with dog's neurotic, or whether or not it's agreeable. Steve, you were going to make a comment, then maybe Joe.
Can you hear me? Is it my screen that's freezing? Can anyone hear me?
You're good. It's Greg.
Okay,
Greg.
I think it's
Greg. All right. So I'm struck by the fact that it's in everyone's interest that I behave reliably than my own sometimes. That is, the value of traits may be as much for other people to be able to predict me as it is for me, for whatever reason I might want to think about myself in terms of traits. So we've got this problem of valuing reliability, but others value my own reliability often more than I do. So as I start to think about the role of traits in human culture, wouldn't it be wonderful if, I don't really think it would be wonderful, but I can see from a certain cultural angle, it would be wonderful if everyone were simply predictable and could be understood by giving them, what are those things called? Integrity tests as they apply for a job at the local supercenter grocery store. If only we could figure out where to put people, et cetera. So for me, the problem of reliability is as much a social value question as it is a question that I confront myself as I try to think about myself.
To me, that is really important, and it becomes one of the things that is a value, right? Like we're constantly at a very base level trying to quickly predict the future, right? We're trying to make up models and sort of go, what's going to happen next so that I can navigate that and do well with that. And that's partially why things like somebody who's trustworthy becomes really valuable to me, because I don't have to keep reconfiguring if I can trust them or not, right? So them being reliable to me and in a certain way is a feedback loop that is going to feed some of that stability in many, many circumstances. You always have the option of a bad actor who may get more out of kind of, you know, hurting people's feelings or cheating on someone or whatever. So that's going to be in the mix potentially, but this is why we value trust in my mind. And that would tend, I think it's a great point, that would tend toward reliability and be another reason why some of these ideas about ourselves being certain ways and making them stick may be evolutionarily really helpful to us and a part of the mix that's in here. What I'm sort of making the point of is that once this becomes important to be able to change, there are things about ourselves that we can see that make that change much easier than I think a lot of people currently in psychology and in other places are openly saying about it. What I was hoping this talk would talk about more is not so much persistent traits, but sort of why we choose what to value and you know, that value matrix, right? Because values are at the heart of so many of these choices, right? These are how, if I value certain things, that through my behavior is going to come out at a trait that you might name me under, right? Because I value being quiet or being more introspective or whatever those things are. To me, we're in this constant overlapping, most of which is unconscious to us, of valuing certain sensations and feelings and what I believe about something and all this stuff. And we're making this big salience landscape of all that, which is pulling my attention to certain places, all based on what I'm valuing and what feels most important. And if I'm neurotic, I'm going to, you know, be the codependent who's completely lost myself and actually atrophied even my own in touchness with what I personally think I value about me, because what I value is my partner being happy or something. Like, what would make me happy? Well, if you could just make her happy, I'd be okay, because I'm so neurotic and worried about it. However, if I'm narcissistic on the other end, I can't even model what other people care about, because all I care about is how do I win here, what's going on there, et cetera. Right? And so both of those value the world incredibly differently. And each of us in our navigating of even getting up to make a sandwich or making value judgments about, should I go this way around the island or that way, right? So this whole navigation is our meaning making is all based on what we're valuing at different levels of consciousness across the whole way. And playing with those values is one of the largest movers of what might end up coming out as a different trait or a different thing to care about. Like an addict is not going to get sober, clearly, not to just oversimplify this, until they deeply value going through all the pain of breaking those relationships and the dysfunction and all that, to do the very hard thing that has to be based in valuing a completely different way of being, right?
One quick comment. When I first began thinking about the problem of value, I was preoccupied with such questions as, is it better to seek happiness or to seek wisdom? Is it better to seek money or to seek personal satisfaction, et cetera? So those kinds of big value questions preoccupied me, and they still do. I'm still puzzling over what is the good life. What happened to me that pushed me into the second stage, which gets me thinking about traits, although that's just one example, is as important as these big questions. What should I be seeking? Should I be seeking my own happiness or other people's happiness, et cetera? How I think about myself, what I see in myself as most real, is itself a value problem. So it's as much a question of what am I as it is a question of what I should be. Value permeates both questions.
I agree.
And it's not clear how a psychologist can get me out of this. I mean,
I think
wait.
Can we get Joe get a quick? Oh, sorry.
Can I just say something back to that? So Steve, I think that it's, I don't know how useful it is to be in some kind of debate of should I value this or value that. What I think humans are doing is we want it all, right? And it's incredibly contextual. And if it's going to serve me and my own needs to whatever degree are being met, I may value helping others in that moment. later, it may be really important to value my own needs. Like, I need a nap. You're not as important right now. I have to go lie down. Our value landscape is moving and changing all the time. And so even in the thing when in Gregg's work, if we start to say, hey, these 3 values are really important, I'm not disagreeing with that. They really are. But in reality, under different contexts and different circumstances, my value landscape is going to shift all over the place, right? And so, and depending on that, because of the ease of living my life, if I can get myself into patterns, if I can start to trust the people around me, we find ourselves in deep grooves that we start calling and saying, this is who I am. I'm just the guy who's the funny dude on Friday night, and I really like to read, and I do these all things. But I could be 1,000 other things if I wanted to be. But now the gravity that I've set up around me socially and my own habits and the things that I trust and my own self-talk has ground me into, I am this thing. Right? But that is way more malleable if we can realize that in truth, I would like to leave a legacy and make a lot of money and not look selfish and, you know, have a great love affair and have wonderful best friends. And, you know, in any moment, if you ask me, some of those are more important than others, and that may be more persistent over my life or not. But it's not like we should pick one value and really go for it, and that's going to be the winner, because we value a ton of different things in a ton of different directions.
Amen. Joe's been waiting.
Actually, sorry. Hello?
Yeah.
Hello. Actually, Voldemort had his hand up before I did. So can I defer to Voldemort and then come back to it? Because mine doesn't follow from from Rob's very logically.
Sure. I'm fascinated by all this talk about fluidity in the way we are. I use the term the way we are specifically to avoid the traps of trait and personality and all that. From my experience as a physician, people are in fact variable, but they are not, but usually we are not randomly variable. So we can change our values for this sinking boat here or that sinking boat over there. But my experience suggests to me that when I look at people's fluidity in that regard, it's when they become randomly variable that they are in trouble psychologically. So I agree there's variability, but underneath that, it really looks to me like, and I'd be happy to hear anybody who sees it differently, it really looks to me like each person has something at their core. I think we can get caught up in words and miss the idea that Leland is Leland. I am Waldemar. You can get Leland to behave as a non-introvert. You would have to work a lot harder for me to act as a non-introvert. But after you're gone, I'm still an introvert. That's just a word. It's a word that expresses something about the core of me. The core of me is different than the core of Nicholas. There are overlaps, yes. And we try to make the overlaps work together. That is, we try to not be random in our variables. But I think please show me why there is not something in each of us that is our core that we revolve around. We have different facets, but it's the same gem. It's the beauty of each person being different. I'm really impressed by that. When I look at the biological world, human beings, all the things we have in common, and yet every one of us is different. So yeah, variability exists, but somewhere there's a core and we don't yet know how to describe it.
I'll limit my response to a single sentence. That core could very well be a story. rather than a constellation of traits, forms, etc. So the question then becomes, what is that core? How do we come to understand that core, which is a critical question.
I agree. I
Your
agree.
story and my story and Gregg's story and everyone in this Zoom room, I guess that's what you call it, is living a different story. So if I become an extrovert, I will not be the same extrovert that Gregg is when Gregg becomes just the same extrovert on the NEOPI. We can get the exact same scores on the NEOPI, but we're living different stories.
You know, when I think about the question of core, I think about prototype theory of language, of meaning. So we tend to think that our concepts have precise classical definitions. You know, a square, a circle. You can come up with a definition of what a square and a circle is. That's a set of singly necessary features and jointly sufficient. But for everyday categories, you can't do that. Chair, flower, tool, mother. Can't do it. And we have this intuition that there really is a definition of what a mother is or what a chair is. And then we go look for it, and we look for it, and we can't find it. But you say, it's really there. It's really there. But the point is that the chair, our chairs, and our mothers and these, they're defined by a family resemblance of features, a set of typical features. And so what this core is that you're talking about, Voldemort, I mean, yeah, we do experience core. We do have stability. There has to be, or else it doesn't make any sense talking about a person. But whether there's this kind of fixity to it, rather than a dynamism of a constellation or a dynamism, I think that's the issue. We are unique, but even in our uniqueness, we're not a single thing. I think we're a dynamic something. I think even at our core.
Yeah, our social nature.
Well, there's also layers of reality, right? There's layers of reality. We could talk about a chair, and we could talk about the wood and the whatever this is, or we could talk about it on an atomic level, or we could, you know, and there's truths at each of those sort of judgment layers of what a chair may be. If we talk about a mother, right, we could talk about, well, what is it biologically to be a mother? But then are we assuming a nurturing thing or something else, right? So these meanings are all different. When I think about identity, you can absolutely sit in meditation consistently. I mean, I could speak of it from my perspective, but also many, many thousands of people can talk about this, where yourself absolutely dissolves away. And you can see very clearly that there's a construction that happens, you know, quite automatically at some level, but there is a story of self that comes up. And you know, people in AI that are beginning to create self or doing their best to do it are thinking about, you know, there's some relationship between out there and in here, but we're making up each of them, right? There's this kind of self-arising creation of self in relation to something out there. And there's a lot of reason to make a bunch of that persist. And there's a lot of biology that would have that persist, right? I could go work on getting better at basketball, and there's a huge range of basketball, but I'm probably never going to play in the NBA, right? So it's not just totally random, to your point, but there's a much vaster ability to change and shift and be different than you are if you want to. But guess what? We're going to have to value that change, or we won't do it. It won't occur. Okay.
So that's a much better segue, Rob, for what I wanted to raise. And it was actually the first question that I raised on the chat. And so let me frame it this way and ask anybody, but Steve in particular, do biologists then have the same fact value is-ought problem in their studies to the same degree that psychologists do? And then do physicists have the same problem at the same level? And then do mathematicians have the same problem?
I'm going to answer that question first based on my 17th or 18th century level understanding of science.
Okay.
In other words, we'll leave the developments in 20th century biology and physics aside because I have not fully assimilated them. But if I'm thinking in terms of classical science, the is-ought problem is clearly relevant at all levels: matter, life, mind. when it comes to human culture, human psychology, the problem for me is that the is has become an ought. The distinction has finally broken down. It, at least from my naive 17th, 18th century science perspective, it isn't so. The is-ought problem retains its original meaning in biology and physics and the like, the way I understood the is-ought problem as a undergraduate in my early days. What's happened to me is I've seen the is-ought problem transform at the level of culture into a blur where I can no longer clearly distinguish the two. That is my crisis. That is what I'm hoping the ToK can help me with. And one potential way out of my malaise is to at least limit this crisis to the domain of culture, so that the is-ought problem is still a problem at the other domains, but it has a special status at the cultural level.
So can I propose a thesis then?
Sure.
Okay. And I don't disagree with what you've said at all. In fact, I've experienced the crisis in a very similar way. But here's the thought I want to throw out to everybody. And thank God none of you are sociologists. Is it not the case when we think of the ToK? Isn't it the problem? Isn't the issue well, let me put it this way. Sorry, I'm babbling. I think there's an inverse proportion between, and certainly at the macro level, between variability, behavioral variability at each level. And that behavioral variability is precisely what makes it problematic. And we get increasingly muddied, both in terms, and especially when we get to the level of culture. And let me put it to you this way. So you talk about, especially for you psychologists, which I've always admired far more than my own discipline because of your scientific rigor. Now you're saying, no, Joe, we're all fucked in psychology too. We don't know what we're doing. But that said, let me put it to you this way. Are not the traits that psychologists study, even though they do vary, and by the way, the resolution in my mind, it is because everything's relational. That's the direction we have to go. We don't know who we are, whether we're even happy or not, unless we have some point of reference and and so on. But my bigger point is that, so if you think there's instability at the level of psychological traits, and I agree that there are, and you guys know this way better than I do, sociologically and culturally, there's even far greater degrees of freedom and variability. So the things that we measure things like, oh, income distributions. Well, how stable is your income? That can change radically over the course of a lifetime, or the next day if you win the lotto, right? So, I mean, my point is that the cultural dimensions of existence are far more unstable. And yet that's what I study. I'm trying to predict behavioral outcomes on the basis of social forces and cultural reference points. That's, to me, even more unstable than the personality traits, which are more unstable, to get back to Lee's example, than the alleles, which is more unstable than at least the macro interactions of physical reality, and that's even more unstable than mathematics. Math, we say, well, here's the system, right? And then we come with our does that make sense to anybody? And please tell me if I'm misunderstanding this, because this is a big issue for me too.
Yeah, I think it's a stacking more and more is-ought problem as you go up for exactly the reasons you just said. And it's getting more and more complicated as you go up to even decide what the oughts are. So first, I think Michael, pointed out, and it's something, I definitely talked about in my talk a few weeks ago, that us not knowing that we're making this mistake between is and ought is the foundational, maybe the starting point issue. But then once we even can agree that we're in an ought kind of description at a cultural level, it's hard to even decide what those oughts are, right? Because we can't align ourselves value-wise very wisely yet. That's what I think we need to start working on as quickly as possible to figure out how we all function better. But yeah, Joe, I agree with what you said.
Steve, oh, there it is. I'm looking for an example of ought in physics.
I'll defer to others. The only example I can, I don't think deeply about physics or biology. The example that comes to mind is the Manhattan Project, and the nuclear.
The choice of projects, you're correct. The choice of projects, what to observe, what undertakings to do, what hypotheses to put out, all those are judgment things. But if I really, really thought that hydrogen should have 2 protons, it still just has 1.
Correct. So that's how, and again, this may reflect a naive pre-20th century understanding of science, but that's how I think about the is-ought problem at the level of physics and the like. It is what it is, whatever it is, the rock, the amoeba, the allele, or whatever else. It is what it is. And then we have to ask questions about what we value. Do we want to develop this or that particular weapon using our knowledge of physics? At the culture, it isn't what it is, because the is so permeated with value that you can no longer distinguish the two anymore. So what is self-esteem? I can't answer that question except as a cultural being making value judgments. So I would
I'm almost there, but I still have a problem, or I'm struggling with one aspect of this. Okay, so we talk about people being taller or shorter, heavier or lighter, and we think we can measure that relatively objectively and consistently. Although even that changes, right, to some degree with the environment. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of behavioral stability. If we talk about whether somebody's, aggressive, and I love that example, whoever was talking about aggression earlier, maybe it was a couple of people, because the sociological problem is that we've confused the is-ought so dramatically that it's hard to talk about aggression and violence, because if you don't talk about it the right way, you'll have people attacking you. Okay, literally attacking you because you're being either well, you can fill in the blank. You can imagine the different ideological positions. Okay, so I'll give you a very simple example, and then maybe you can use this as a way of closing my part of this. So in violence, which is what I study a lot of, there's a big debate about the amount of intimate partner violence that exists, and that debate revolves especially around, on the one hand, people who view the family violence researchers who say, well, actually, a lot of people get into conflicts, and sometimes at their worst moments, they'll push each other or slap each other. And that happens once in a while. We don't like it. We're not proud of it, blah, blah, blah. But guess what? There's a lot of that stuff that goes on. You grab somebody in a moment of anger, et cetera, et cetera. And then the feminist research perspective says, no, violence is male dominated. And if you look at the statistics, who's involved way overwhelmingly in the homicides and the serious, and especially in intimate partnerships as well. Yes, some women do kill men, but overwhelmingly it's men killing women. Overwhelmingly it's men who are sexual predators, and so on and so forth. So you've got 2 different views of violence or aggression, okay? And I've come to the conclusion, and please feel free to disagree or give me a different way of looking at this, that both, of course, are right at some level, depending on what it is that you're talking about behaviorally. So if you're talking about the number of people who have killed other people, then yeah, there is a gendered component in the sense that we can look at the statistical proportions. I don't say that therefore all men, or it's an essentialist trait of men to be aggressive. I would say that any of us could kill somebody if we were in the right conditions as such. You attack my son, even though I'm incredibly nonviolent, I may be incredibly violent in that particular instance. You follow? And then similarly, at the other end of the spectrum, is it not the case that all of us or most of us can be aggressive in our speech and our actions at times towards others, right? So there's a continuum. And in sociology, we're really confused in terms of how we define the phenomena that we're studying. And then we can't even explain it, because once you explain it one way, you're going to be critiqued for being ideologically driven or wrong because you haven't chosen the proper normative perspective on violence. You haven't accepted that all men are violent and all societies, at least the contemporary, are patriarchal, and so on. I mean, that's a caricature. But you see the problem? So we get very little traction in sociology in making substantive or scientific claims. We sound very ideological because I think we haven't resolved. I think we've gotten completely confused by the is-ought problem, and we have no firm basis from which to make our judgments. Our scientific judgments, let's say, what we're calling science. In fact, a lot of people say it's not science at all. It's just a bunch of language game we play.
I don't know if what I'm going to say will address that clearly. I'm going to try. Leyland asks about ought in physics, and he's correct to ask that question, it seems to me. I don't know enough about physics to answer those questions. My sense is that there may be oughts in physics, but they're not important to physics. They're very important to the social sciences. And it has to do, I think, because of the fundamentally different ways in which we come to know objects versus the people and psychological processes. In my opinion, you can't know a psychological process in the same way as you know a thing. You can observe a thing. We cannot even describe behavior without an intersubjective framework. You can't describe behavior objectively. When you say he put, he stood, she walked, those are not descriptions of objective events. Those are descriptions that are predicated on a certain psychological interpretation of the act, that there's an intent, that there's a power to regulate the action. It's not something that is simply observable. And so our very categories are fundamentally intersubjective, not objective. And therefore, the value presuppositions are always there, and we can't ignore them. The trick for me is that what we can do is we can be reflective about what our value presuppositions are. And we can separate conceptually what we may not be able to separate in our actions, and understand reflexively how our values frame what we do and what we say. And I think that that's a lot of what's not going on in sociology, what you're talking about, Joe. You know, the explicit ideological, political ideological bent that says this is the way, you know, this is the political way to define something. Frankly, I find that to be painfully easy to discount, because you just say, hey, look, there's your assumptions, there's your values. Mm-hmm. You're not, you know,
easy for you to say. I'm surrounded by 70% of sociologists who actually think that, no, that's the way to think about the world.
Yeah, well,
no, but look at Mike has an incredibly, Michael, sorry if I don't know if you go by Mike or not, but there's a really incredibly important thing there. We have to start like explicitly talking about the oughts. Right? If we're going to be in language, like we have to back up and realize how much our descriptions are including oughts, and get more mindful of what oughts we're all deciding on that matter, right? Because Joe, it doesn't take very long for you to explain those 2 points of view, and other intelligent human beings holding both of those won't get lost in some clash about that's not what that means, etc. And I also want to echo what Michael said and what everybody said. I mean, nobody's wrong here. Back to Lee's thing about physics. In theory, like ought has everything to do with the human, right? And humans working together. So no, it's not in physics theoretically. It's only in the part of the humans that are interacting with physics that the ought starts to get involved down there, right? There isness, right? Isness is there. And at some point, mind split off from that and is now interacting with that isness. And that mind is creating oughts all the time. And we're not very good at seeing when we're doing that and how we're doing that. And this is the most important thing that we could start to understand more, so that our culture and our societies could start behaving better, and we can change our personal behavior with this as well. That's the game that's on the table to figure out. And Michael seems to be very clear on what it is. And I agree with him that once you see this and understand it, language becomes a very different thing. You start claiming different things. You start being careful with what you promise. You start to understand other value motivations and where people are lost, et cetera. It's just a huge wisdom pointer to start caring about the oughts and how people are valuing. I start trusting, sorry, and I'll shut up in a second. I start trusting what I see people valuing over what they're telling me almost immediately, right? I can know so much more about a person by how they're choosing to talk about things and all that, rather than truth claims they make to me, simply because I understand what's going on with ought much more deeply than they do quite often.
I have one more story if you have a second here that may bear on this. I have worked as a quality management consultant, and the key problem is to figure out what the word quality means in this shop. And there's a story that's told, and I think it's a true one. Back in the good old days, people wanted good peas. I mean, if you get a can of peas, you want it to be good peas. And somebody figured out that that has to do with the firmness or tenderness of it. And they actually came up with a gadget that can measure the firmness of peas. So they reduced the thing about we want good peas down to take a pea, put it in this gadget, and if it turns red, it's bad, and if it turns green, it's good. And that kind of settled the whole thing. So I continue to argue here that a lot of, if we're arguing in circles, just examine whether or not we've gotten down to the core of the definition of what we're dealing with. And Michael shakes his head no.
You're muted, Mike. You're muted.
All I said was, Leyland, I think you're adorable, and that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you.
The thing that's interesting, and I think Lee might represent this club, and I don't want to misrepresent you, so I don't mean to speak about you, but I think there's a very materialistic, and I think this is the problem with psychology. I don't know if Gregg would kick me in the balls for this one, but you know, this is the issue, that part that we can't see inside the brain, that there's mind, there's non-material space going on, and that's actually where we live. Right. And yet this persistent material out here is so foundational, and in the evolution of things as we understand it came first, that we base all our science on this materialistic frame. And psychology into sociology is this first place where we're trying to do this inner talk, and we're trying to be scientific about it. But science is really the study of sort of external, right? Like what's out here objectively going on that we can make fact claims about, et cetera. And we have this whole messy mind space on the interior that's going on. And I think generally, Lee, just lovingly, because you and I have talked so much sort of offline, I think that your default where you really want to get back to is like, how do we find this root truth in this thing? And sometimes it's just more messy.
Right. So
you said, but I think about it a little bit differently. I think it has to do with the age of the discipline. So math is the oldest and it's the firmest, and then there's physics, and then that's firm, and chemistry is getting there, and biology has a ways to go. And then once you go into psychology and so on, it has to do with the age of the discipline and the number of things that have been able to be studied in enough depth to be nailed down. That's the way I think about it. I might be completely wrong.
Can I ask Steve to summarize where he's at now with this? Because I don't get to hear Steve as often, and I'd really value what you have, what your conclusions are today, where you're at with it. If that makes any sense.
Well, it does, and it's difficult to summarize how I think through this. My sense is that the reductionist tendency on the part of many psychologists is at least partly understandable in terms of a kind of desire for consistency and reliability. As you move up the tree of knowledge, there's greater variability, as we talked about before. The beauty of the lower levels in the tree of knowledge is, well, when you get to the bottom, you get rocks. And if only the personality were like a rock, if only, going back to the quest for the historical Jesus, if only Jesus were like a rock and we can identify exactly who he is in the abstract, then our puzzles and problems would be solved. So when we move to the level of culture, what we have is variability, relationship, interpretation, no is that emerges in its pure form. So the is and the ought blend. And now we got to figure out what to do with that. Now, going back to the tree of knowledge, I want to suggest that at some level prior to culture, and I don't know how fully to articulate this, what unites us with other members of the animal kingdom is the notion of need. And somehow we need to address the question, how do we understand the relationship between phenomenal need that is organically rooted and is not simply a capricious value judgment, and the values that emerge in culture that represent our cultural ways of dealing with need? So the next phase in my set of problems is to explore how this is-ought problem at the level of culture links back to phenomenon that emerge pre-culture. So this is not, I'm not entertaining here a postmodern all is ought at the level of culture, because ought somehow, some way needs to speak the language that we are, and we are need-based beings. And that itself is an is statement. I know that this is kind of a tangled, rambling way of putting it, but it at least kind of captures the direction I'm trying to move.
Very helpful from my perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very nice summary, Steve. And it's just, for me, what it speaks to is psychology's entanglement with philosophy. And that if we're actually going to talk intelligently about the discipline, to simply proclaim science is in many ways nonsensical, because you have to then understand the knowledge claims that you're making from. So you have to link it to a meta-psychology of some sort, or else, or unless your meta-psychology then is modern empirical natural science, and then you're an empirical psychologist, that then is going to follow, say, your methodologist in that regard. So for me, the take-home message certainly is that the problem of value is pervasive. The problem of language is pervasive in relation. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we are kicked into a postmodern, extreme socially constructive relativism. But it does mean we have a profound problem of psychology that clearly has, the discipline itself has barely even grappled with, yet alone resolved.
I'd like just one more sentence. Psychology is haunted by the problem of value, as I said at the beginning, but value is, and this is another presentation for another day, value, the problem of value is haunted by the problem of need. And eventually that is, well, again, another problem for another.
Hey, well, I love that, because obviously I would talk to maybe even need and justification, especially go to human, and then actually you will get to behavioral investment value as an investment value system, which then gets into justification, which then gets into, and my insights for the day had to do with wisdom energy and how to call wisdom energy. And Joe knows a little bit about that, and I was flipping out about that. So all this can link back, but Steve, I mean, really, I wish to God that the people taking 101 could, take your class and appreciate the conundrums of our field, and you see them really brilliantly. And, I've really enjoyed our journeys together in these conversations. So, and it's actually really fun for me to see you and Mike get some opportunity to exchange, because I know both of you very well. And I was like, oh, you guys will actually dance quite well together on some of these issues. So.
Let me just say, by the way, I got to go too, but let me just say, I'd love to bring you all in and have you part of, be at my university and create a new university. I mean, other than the fact that you're a bunch of white males, but other than that, you just,
It's funny how that works.
Sorry about that, dude.
Surprise, I might. That's a trait that I'm stuck with.
Yeah. So, oh well. All righty, guys, that's a wrap. Then, Steve, it will save on your computer if you can do that. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise, and